just before we kind of get into the session today, which obviously we're very excited about, those of you who may be brand new to the EX space and what we're all about, we're an online learning community of EX professionals in various fields, from the worlds of internal comms, employee experience, employee engagement. We've got some L&D people. So anybody that kind of works in a people-centric role, we're here to help upskill, provide tools, templates, resources, and hear from experts like we have today. Loads of great events like these ones. So if you're not a member already, my first question is why not? It's absolutely free to join, and there's loads of amazing resources on there for free. And we also have our professional level of membership as well, where you get access to all of the additional learning, masterclasses, tools and techniques. So if you signed up for the session today, you will get the recording back, and there's a little bit more information about the EX space that will come out with that mailer as well. But what you are all here for today is this fantastic session that we have here. We are joined by the brilliant Tamar Cohen. And this session is called The Emotional Engine Behind Experience Design. So in a moment, I'll pass you over to Tamar to tell you a little bit about what the session is all about. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about her. So Tamar brings over 20 years of experience creating human-centric transformations across customer and employee journeys, designing loyalty and engagement programs, experience research initiatives, and culture design strategies across both large and small organisations. And her success is really centred around relationship building, bringing the business together to create best-in-class experiences, which, as you may know, is what we are all about here, whilst maximising business value as well. So I will delighted to hand you over. Tamar, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Wish I could see you all, but it's great to meet you, and thank you all for being here. I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll kick off. I think there'll be plenty of time for questions. I really hope to make this interactive. And because this is just a topic I'm incredibly passionate about and just absolutely love sharing and discussing. And there we go. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Katie, for that, intro. Just super quick, I'll introduce, I guess not myself, but I'll introduce my company. I lead a company called Halo Effect, and Halo Effect really is about the employee experience. We really work with companies to help them drive their change from the inside out. So we look at everything from culture and the behaviors that are manifesting throughout the organization, and are they actually supporting the business goals? And usually it starts with looking at the employee life cycle, looking at the journey, and identifying those blockers or those areas of opportunity where companies can help optimize, energize, educate sometimes their employees, and actually bring forward that energy that'll then drive the business results. And so that's really where we're focused on. I also do a lot of writing for an organization, for a online magazine called Reworked. You can find that at reworked.co and just search my name. You'll see a bunch of articles, but frankly, there's a ton of great content written by, just some brilliant researchers and writers there. So highly recommend content there. So let's just get into it. Let's start a little bit. And why are we even talking about emotions, right? Why does this matter? Well, when we think about data and really what drives us from an organizational perspective, that tells us what happened, right? Now there's a big trend towards predictive analytics. That gives us a probability or even a statistical chance of what might happen. But what is usually behind the surface, and the question that many people don't have a good way of answering, is why is this happening? Perception and emotion really are deeply intertwined in the employee journey. So as you develop your strategies, as you think about employee experience, as you think about even how you're setting up HR, workplace dynamics, workforce planning, understanding where those positive perceptions and emotional connections are really is what enhances the decision-making process and the connection that employees have to their organization. And this then will ultimately drive business outcomes and foster that long-term success when people feel connected, when they feel that they're seen, that they belong, and can contribute meaningfully to their organization. So why does it matter? Well, it starts from the inside out. We worked with Ann Beal of Beal Market Research, and she did a really interesting study with companies like McDonald's, GoDaddy, and others. And what she actually found was that people tend to react first and then apply rational thinking to that emotion. So what does that mean? It basically means that we think we're in charge of every decision that we're making, and we're doing it incredibly logically and in structured thought. But what ends up happening actually more often than not is that we make a decision based on an emotional or an intuitive gut reaction. We'll have that reaction, and then we sort of apply rational thought why we might have had that reaction. And this is really important because when we start understanding that we're not really driven by our highly rational thought process, it helps us understand a little bit more that role that emotions play, because it's that gut instinct, that gut reaction that people, we all have. But when we realize how much we're actually sort of monitored by that, it really helps us understand the importance that emotions play. So she has a couple of really interesting stats. Now, this is more on the purchase perspective, but this is the same thing, and it applies within an organization as well in terms of how employees feel about their place of work. But if we take it just to the purchase level, 86% of purchases have at least one emotional driver. And those emotional drivers can be something like, I had a real crap day at work today and I deserve a treat. Or it can be, I want to buy this product because it's going to make me look good in front of my friends, right? So it's not always about, emotions as we think of them, but it's normally based around this idea of how we feel, how we want to look to others and how we want ourselves to feel. And it goes beyond that, right? So if there's at least one emotional driver in, almost 90% of what we buy, those purchases actually tend to have about 10 emotional drivers based on the research that Beal did. And this could be everything from, if I want to buy a pair of sneakers, I want to buy them because they're going to make me look cool. I deserve a treat. I got a bonus at work. A lot of these like justified, I'm sort of talking very justified language, but it's based on that sort of emotional reaction of, it actually goes back to the heart of Ariana Grande, I want it, I like it, I got it, I want it, whatever that sort of song is, but it's basically that same idea, that same construct. So there was a study that was done by Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize winning psychologist and really one of the first behavioral economists. Sorry, I don't know why I have a hard time with that word. But what he did, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and I highly recommend it actually as a book to everybody. I think it's fascinating reading. And he had identified with his research that only about 15% of our decision making is actually rational, while 85% is emotional or subconscious thought. So when we think we understand by looking at data and looking at numbers in front of us, that we can really understand and target exactly how people are going to react. We can't possibly, because people are governed by their emotions. They're governed by that emotional and subconscious thought. So you can see here, even just through this iceberg metaphor, that what we see or what we think we know is only 15% of the story, with the bulk, right, the emotion, what's happening beneath the surface, what drives us is completely below the surface, can't be seen, and is defined as irrational. So how does this start to manifest? When we sort of think about how we work in the employee experience space, or even in the design space, right? We know what that takes, right? You do your, your assessment, you do your listening, you do your focus groups, you build out the listening channels, you create journeys, you build out the, connections. And there's a very linear and data-led design behind it all. But when you sort of understand the role that emotions can play along the way, it becomes really, really interesting when you sort of start looking at how emotions actually can blindside us when we're kind of thinking through a traditional, let's say, journey. So there was research that was done actually in 2011 by Shai Danziger, Jonathan Vav, and Leora Peso that identified that judges tend to make harsher decisions, like denying parole, the closer they get to lunch, and more lenient decisions immediately after a break. So what were some of the studies? So they found that the likelihood of granting parole or creating a more lenient decision decreases as the morning progresses. They get more cranky, they get more hungry, and they're actually anticipating the break. But once they're back from the break, the decisions became significantly more lenient, with the rate of granting parole jumping up to about 65%. So that is significant. So what are some of the elements that are actually driving behind this? Well, if you think about a typical day that you're having, right? If you are constantly forced to make decision after decision after decision, you get exhausted, right? You just experience what's called decision fatigue, as do judges. This is their job, right? And so as they're making, decision after decision, which is effectively, choice after choice, it can tend to get more harsh or more conservative because their mental resources are waning. When you have a break, when you have lunch, you're replenishing your energy, and the decision fatigue is then likely to get enhanced. In terms of anchoring and simplification, the more judges become fatigued, the more they're relying on mental shortcuts or heuristics, and they're trying to streamline their decisions. So they might actually start to anchor on decisions that they've made in the past, things that feel safe or almost like a default approach. They limit their mental expenditure by leaning into something that might be tried and true, something that might actually help them expedite and move more quickly. And this can actually really identify how sort of these situational factors, like hunger, right? Hangry is a real thing, and it helps skew decision making. And in terms of the present bias, so behavioral economics talks about the fact that individuals will prioritize their immediate needs over the long-term consequences, especially when fatigued. So again, before break, judges were really just leaning into the fact that I want to get to lunch, I want to get out of here, I need to stretch. And they will prioritize that quicker, mentally facilitated decision rather than putting the full weight on a case in front of them, making decision after decision really as rationally as we thought. So let's talk a little bit about the definitions of experience. So I have customer experience here as well, because that is the world that I live in. I live in both sort of the EX and CX space. And I think though it's also very important for those of us, regardless of how we're interacting with customers, to remember that whatever we're designing, whatever we're creating, we want to think about that customer perspective. And this definition of customer experience, I think, is really important as we talk about the role of emotions in experience design. So I really like the HBR, the Harvard Business Review definition, because it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. And that is that CX is the customer's internal and subjective response to any direct or indirect contact with a company. So this is really leaning into the fact that we're trying to identify what is the customer's personal, emotional, subjective reaction that they might be having. This identifies the fact that it can be incredibly personal, that it's really almost in a moment, and very directed to understanding what are those emotional drivers of loyalty, of engagement, and the like. And the same goes for employee experience. And again, Harvard Business Review, I think, really nailed it in terms of a definition, which is the sum of everything an employee goes through throughout their connection to an organization, from the first contact point as a potential hire to the last touch point after employment ends. So that connection, that word connection, I think is really, again, that driver. How do I feel when I apply to an organization? How do I feel when the recruiter reaches out, or if I'm getting ghosted? Is the communication consistent? Once I'm onboarded, how do I feel about the people that I'm meeting? Am I getting trained appropriately? Am I drinking from a fire hose, as it were? Right. So what are those elements that actually keep me connected and keep me engaged from acquire all the way through retire? So with all of that said, I love this quote by Oscar Wilde: "The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about." And just personally, hell is being talked about. But, the idea here is that, if we are trying to target those emotions, we want people to feel good. We want them to, feel connected to brands. We want them to talk about us in social media. We want employees, raving about us on Glassdoor and other forums where they go. So here we have a 95% rate of connection from Harvard Business Review, right? So that's different than the 85% we saw from Kahneman. And honestly, the numbers that I've seen since the Kahneman book came out is higher. So, if that was the very first study, studies since that time are actually identifying that these connections are actually higher than we thought. But what's interesting is that we're seeing now, BAV research identified that a third of customers have no strong emotional connection to any brand. And Gallup has identified that over 79% of employees are neither disengaged or engaged. And they call this the idea of the meh economy, right? They're not engaged. There's no strong emotional response really in any direction. So if we kind of think about the fact that people are neither engaged, they're neither disengaged, we're not creating that connection to our potential customers, our potential employees, we have a huge gap, right? So if we know that 95% of those decisions, and those decisions, especially for employees, can be whether I stay, whether I am connected, whether I feel engaged, whether I want to actively promote and recommend this company to others. If we're not capturing that energy of employees, we have a massive gap and a massive opportunity in our hands. And a little bit of data. I'm a little bit of a graph nerd, but there's a really it helps to understand a little bit where people's heads are at and why this might be happening, because it is taking up a lot of our mental energy, a lot of our emotional energy. For those of you that follow the Edelman Trust Index, this is an index that comes out every year, usually around January. And I can't recommend enough just downloading this thing and reading it. It doesn't make for joyful reading, but it makes for really interesting reading. And what the index covers is they look at the rate of trust for 4 key areas. The first is government, media, business, and then nonprofits, or NGOs, I think they call it. And what they found over the years is that, there's been sort of a steady decline in trust in government. I think the real sort of drop off started in the late 60s, had a drop off in the 70s after Watergate, and then has been sort of steadily declining since. With media, there's been a very sharp drop off since for about the last 10 years. And it's been almost like an incredibly steady decline, especially after COVID since then. But the bellwether was always industry, business. And that was really where people were putting most of their trust in terms of an institution that they are sort of surrounded by. And even as their trust in media, their trust in government was going down, their trust in businesses always stayed strong. And that's why we saw a lot of employee advocacy within organizations, especially after 2020, with a lot of the social movements that were happening. And there was a strong demand on leadership to provide spaces for employees to feel like they could voice concerns on what was happening, and to, stand up and make their own voices heard in these, very socially activist spaces, because that's really where they had their trust and what they wanted to see reflected in those institutions. But this is the first year that we've seen not just even a drop in employer trust, but a significant one. Over 3 points down between 2024 to 2025. It's significant. And there's another stat here that I just want to point out really quickly, which is this fear that leaders lie to us. That has climbed up over 12 points this year. So we are not only not feeling like we can trust the institutions that surround us, we don't feel like we are that our leaders are giving us the information, that they are not keeping us fully informed. And that takes a lot of emotional energy. That takes a huge toll. So if we then think about employees not being engaged, if we think about sort of that meh economy coming into play, this is the space that we want to understand, right? There's not much that we can do about this, but we want to understand it because it helps us get into the mindset of where employees and consumers are. And it's leaving money on the table, right? And it is the blind spot. So the lack of trust starts to show up in two ways. First of all, we know that employees that are disengaged, that are not committed to the organization, they're going to have a higher absenteeism rate. This is not a surprise. With highly engaged employees, we know that there is a significant increase in profitability because they are more productive, they're able to be more creative, they're able to be more innovative, and that energy comes into the organization. Ultimately, with the disengaged employees, we want to remember that, employees are exhausted. For when I was in corporate, I don't know how many times I heard, we need to do more with less. I swear if I heard that phrase one more time, I was going to lose it, because you hit a point where there's no less, there's nothing else that we can do. And so, really understanding that once we've lost employees, we really are losing money on the table. And there's the stat here, billions of dollars per year. And in terms of consumers, when a consumer trusts a brand, they are willing to pay more. They're willing to actually shell out the money to almost like buy themselves that peace of mind that they are dealing with a brand that they trust. And when there is an engagement with customer service where, the service is easy, it's consistent, and they feel like they are being supported in a way that allows them to walk away again with that sense of trust intact, that will increase their trust and more likely generate that likelihood to buy. So when we sort of think about workplace decision making, the perception and emotion playing roles, even when employees feel like they're being completely objective, right? When you ask them straight out, like what would make you change roles? What would make you leave a company? They talk about career change, they talk about pay. But the truth is that the emotional drivers say something different. The emotional drivers actually talk to things like the sense of belonging, the sense of connection to their team, the recognition that they get. So when they feel more connected and that there is more trust and loyalty from the organization, even to the employee, that emotional loyalty actually will be a much stronger driver than your sort of traditional rational factors. So when we look at these companies, these are just some examples. And for those of you who are in the US, there was actually a segment on Wegmans, I think it was on 60 Minutes, that was just this past Sunday. Literally, the timing was pretty funny on this. And I highly recommend that you take a look at it, because you look at this family-owned company that has from the beginning worked to meet every manager of every store nationwide to make sure that they are dedicated to high quality, making sure that employees have career paths, that they are taken care of in not only financially, but also in terms of the benefits, And many of these companies have programs that really just go beyond your traditional benefits and incentive programs. They build personal experiences, they develop these cultural support networks, and they really create that, again, that sense of supportive, trustworthy, and fairness within their organization. They focus the not only the employee experiences, but even the workplace experiences on the whole person. And that's where you see conversations positively around things like flexibility, ongoing training, and importantly, mental health support for employees. So companies with these strong cultures really aren't just offering jobs. And this is something that the Wegmans team spoke a lot about. They create that sense of belonging. They create that emotional connection. They understand the values and connections that are asked for by employees, and they reach out. There is a significant amount of time that these organizations spend listening to employees and then building those communities of care around it. So when these are great examples of companies that understand many of these psychological drivers, and they're actually building out that workforce and workplace experience based on developing that emotional connection. So how does this play out, right? What does this actually look like? So this is a very rudimentary little design, just as a quick story. When I was starting my role as the employee experience lead at my last organization, we were really struggling to get the leaders to understand why this mattered, right? There was this sense of, well, employees, get paid well. Why do we need to worry about all of these other elements? Well, because there's a direct influence on employee experience to customer experience, and that will ultimately have an impact on the bottom line. And so what are some of those perceptions, and how does that actually create impact? So we're going to build this out slowly, and we'll do this together. And if there's any questions, please let me know. So if we think about your typical, a typical day, a typical employee, right? If I think about my day, I wake up in the morning, I have a commute to the office, right? And that's going to affect how I feel. There's going to be then, badging into the company. Is that easy enough? Is that, frustrating? I know at one of my jobs, badging in was one of the most frustrating experiences because it didn't read it every time. And sometimes you were literally banging on the door trying to get somebody to open it from the inside. Finding a space, right? A lot of workplaces now have sort of the hoteling or free spaces where you're kind of trying to find a good space where you can sit, where it's quiet. Are your systems up and running? Do you have the right systems? You need to log into multiple programs, multiple systems, all at the same time. Now you've got to update your passwords occasionally. When you're then doing the work, are you beholden to layers of bureaucracy? Are there procedures that kind of get in the way? Are you being measured appropriately? Are the performance measures or even the business measures that you're beholden to appropriate? Or is it really just a lot of busy work? Do I like the team that I'm working with? Do I get on with my manager? What are those team dynamics? Do I have the ability to actually communicate, to communicate fairly with my organization? And do I feel like they are communicating with me? And then finally, am I being trained? Am I being given opportunities to move my career how I see fit, right? Not just necessarily in a prescribed ladder, but if I want to move around, if I want to learn other areas, am I given that opportunity? So these are all of the elements that impact the employee experience. Now, when we think about how this manifests on the outside for our customers, there's a direct impact that goes like this. If we think about, just that typical day that I just laid out. And so if I'm having trouble with my commute, it takes me forever to get in, then I'm struggling to get, my 15 or so different applications loaded and ready to go. The phone is ringing off the hook. Meanwhile, there are a number of policies that have just changed, and I'm supposed to be reading my emails as I'm picking up the phone. I'm not going to be my best self when I answer that phone, right? So all of those experiences create a customer impact. Another example that I'll give you is when we were doing a customer journey for one of my previous clients. We were trying to understand why we were running into a delivery issue where certain deliveries were always arriving after the promised date. And what we actually identified when we looked inside at the employee experience was that we were measuring the delivery not by when it landed at a customer, but by when it actually went out our door. Right? So there's that last mile disconnect. So even though we were tracking that last mile, the employee measurement, the success factors were based on when we got it out the door. And so we were really creating this experience break because we had a policy and a procedure that made sure that we held to internal measures. We had a success metric that was telling us that we needed to make sure that this was out the door by a certain time. But those policies, those procedures, that communication, at no point had the employees understand what the customer ultimately needed. And so we were getting, negative feedback. We were getting a lot of frustrated customers. And, there's a potential for loss. There's a huge reputational risk there. So there is direct impact in understanding what's happening on the internal side of the house to then make sure that we are appropriately managing the outside of the house. And when this is done right, there are positive impacts. So, as customers align their decisions, as employees align their decisions with their values, they also pay attention to how companies treat their employees. So there's research, most of this research is from PwC, that shows that when customers invest in that superior customer and employee experiences, that they can actually charge up to 16% more for their products and services. And another study by MIT actually found that companies in that top quartile of employee experience tend to be more successful in terms of innovation, in terms of creativity, and can generate twice the revenue from those innovations compared with those companies that are in the bottom quartile of their industry. So there is a significant and real impact when you understand what the behaviors are and then how we can actually build those processes internally. So what are some of those employee wants? What are they actually looking for? I hope that these will resonate with you because there's a lot of, certainly when I was doing this research, I was just like, check, 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 absolutely. And the first one is a sense of authority. So employees want to feel autonomy over their work. There is a sense of ownership and pride over outcomes that is important, even in highly structured roles that require, strict guidelines. Those can still be in place. There can still be, guidelines and structure and rules that have to be followed. This isn't about kind of creating a catch-all, but it is about finding those moments of autonomy where there can be some decision-making or engagement by employees to help drive that sense of connection to the work that they're doing. Creating more collaboration. So work is now much more cross-functional, right? We have people that are in the office that are remote. Work now really rarely sits within an individual silo. And so building that collaboration is more and more important, and making sure that we're also creating those social interaction pieces. So for companies also that are remote, building in social connection, building in collaboration moments, building in those moments of trust between teams is more important than ever and really does drive the energy of the team. Finding that growth and development, so finding the opportunities for employees to grow. That Wegmans piece that was just this past Sunday, it talks about people who come in starting their jobs, in their late teens, early 20s as, maybe produce stockers and end up becoming VPs, of marketing of whatever it might be, because they can see the career path. They are investing in training programs, growth programs that allow people to define the path that they want to go and then find the ways to go to meet those goals. Recognition, feeling seen. I think we've probably all had situations where we have just absolutely, worked our butts off, pardon me, to get something done, to get it over the line, only to then see it unrecognized, to not have any kind of sense of validation of, the great work that was done, the high effort that was put in. And so that acknowledgement really is critical. And then keeping and maintaining an open line of feedback is probably one of the most important things. To feel heard, to feel validated, to feel seen. These are all things that we expect out of any relationship that we have, and we expect it from our employer as well. This is just a great quote that I really loved from Michael Bush about great places to work. The leaders at winning companies understand that you don't need to work employees to the point of burnout to be successful. Productivity and performance aren't at odds with supporting your people. I think now more than ever, this idea of burnout and this idea of, as I said before, do more with less. Burnt out employees are going to give you nothing. You're not going to get it from them. There's only so much blood you can squeeze from a stone. And we need to recognize that we need to understand what employees are looking for, and then how do we build a successful team around those needs. So just also to touch on, the customer wants, because as we're building out, emotional engines for experience design overall, well, what are some of the things that customers want? The Harvard Business Review actually did a really interesting study on this, and they highlighted, I think, about 17 different values, but they really roll up to these 5 core elements. So they want to stand out from the crowd. And this really goes back to that research that I showed right up front, where people make most of their purchases based on how they want to feel about themselves and how they want to be seen by others. So what is that sense of standing out that can be delivered in a particular purchase for customers is critical. Having confidence in the future, I think, is such an important one, especially in light of the trust index study that we looked at before. So again, perceiving that the future is better than the past. But what's also interesting is that people also have a strong connection to nostalgia. And you'll find that a lot of advertisements, a lot of positioning might lean into tapping into, remember when, or tapping into, songs from our past or whatever it might be. So that sense of nostalgia is equally as important too, kind of like remembering the good old days. That sense of well-being, right? Again, that trust, that emotional exhaustion, that meh. How do we engage customers to feel like there is a good road ahead? We're going to make you feel good. You will actually feel good about your purchase. That sense of belonging. So an affiliation of people like me. I'm not the only one out there who might be feeling this way. So how do I get that sense of community, of that sense of engagement? And then feeling secure. So again, back to trust. When you don't have trust, you feel unanchored. You feel like you're not connected. So what are those elements that we can deliver to customers to make them feel like, we got you. You're good here. We've earned your trust. We're going to keep your trust. And what you have today will be there tomorrow. So how does that get aligned to the value from employee experience to business results? So this is really just summing up very quickly. When you have a solid employee experience, right, the inside of that cycle, and you're getting employees to feel good about themselves, right? Because again, that difference between employee experience and engagement, employee experience are all of those touch points and intersections that an employee will have during their day. The engagement side is then how they feel about it. It's the sum total of events after going through those experiences. And it will yield, again, the outside of that circle, business impact, right? So when employees feel that they are supported, that they are engaged, they will then be able to deliver results that build that energy, that growth and profitability, that innovation, and goodwill from within the company. Customers see that, customers feel that, they will then return back to the organization really in a sort of a virtuous cycle. So a little bit about how this might play out. And, I just thought this was a great example. I'm not sure if Orange Theory exists outside of the US. I might just look to Katie to see if that's a yes or a no. No. Okay. So Orange Theory it's basically a gym that's been launched in the US. And when you first look at it, I mean, it looks like the people there are nuts. They are all hooked up. It's very almost, when I first saw it, I thought it was, almost cultish. People talk about the Orange Theory classes, the intensity, the community, almost like with this, passion that I'd really never seen about, a gym. I mean, for God's sakes, it's a gym. But what's really interesting about Orange Theory is that it all starts with a goal. So the client writes down their higher purpose and what it is they're actually trying to accomplish. So what they see then, once they've written that down throughout their time within Orange Theory, they have that goal, that remember why you started, that's actually reinforced throughout. They also have almost like a gamification, point-based system that actually sort of turns these ideas of like, dieting and exercise into very discrete, countable points that can then be tallied up over time. When working out, and I actually think I've forgotten to put my things here, sorry. So that's the gamification. Understanding the pain points. So again, how people are showing up, creating that sense of community, to reinforce how people are engaging, bringing them back into the fitness center to continue and push through even the days after with sore muscles. But they also have a very strong test and learn model. So they're constantly iterating, and again with that irrationality and intuitive decision making, they are constantly testing, they're constantly trying new things, new nudges, new engagement methods to identify what works and for what segment, and then how to continue to leverage that throughout. So now I want to get a little bit more tactical about how do we sort of think about the employee experience journey, right? So if we were to kind of take all of this information, bring it back, and then start to think about what does the journey actually look like? Well, I think, what most people are aware of is sort of the more traditional life cycle journey stages, right? You attract, you recruit, you onboard, the employee performs, they then develop and potentially at some point depart. What we have here are statements of what an ideal employee statement might be, right? From attract, I have a positive awareness of the brand. The culture really comes through the recruitment process. I'm connected when I onboard. I'm inspired to excel and my growth is supported and perform. I'm able to build my own career and develop. And then even when somebody departs, we want to make sure that people are posting positively about us in external sources. And so we want to maintain that strong relationship. And so what we need to do then is internally build out those statements to really understand what do we need to do, right? What are our goal statements to achieve that outcome for employees? So for attract, if we want employees to have a positive awareness of the brand, we need to make sure that we're targeting people who know what we stand for. And by the way, that starts with we know what we stand for, right? We're really clear about that. To make sure that the culture comes through at every step of the way, we have to make sure that we interview and assess for culture fit. When we onboard, we want to make sure that we're building those connection and networks and helping people achieve that productivity quickly and effectively. To perform, we have to make sure that our systems, our tools, and even our performance measurements are optimized so that we can create that sense of support from employees. We have to make sure that our own house is in order. For develop, we want to make sure that we have that leadership development program to make sure that we have training to reskill and upskill as needed, to get that readiness for employees. Because even if they don't necessarily want to move out or across of their role, their roles by design are changing, right? AI is just one aspect, but it's a huge aspect. Rather than just bringing in new people all the time, we can train people, we can upskill and reskill. And then when from a departure perspective, ensuring that there's a strong alumni network in place to maintain that connection to the organization. And it's all held together by culture. Making sure that we are very clear on our mission, on our vision, what we stand for, and then what those behaviors are that actually create each of these statements to be true. So there's a really great view, again, Harvard Business Review, that talks about this idea of the value pyramid. And this is just a great example, and I'll bring up just a more close-up view of it. They identified these 36 elements that really help drive businesses out of that sort of commoditized phase. And what I love about this is that this is just a great view that really, I think, articulates everything that we've been talking about. How do we highlight those business, how do we achieve those emotional connections? Because if you look at this like a Maslow's hierarchy, right, with the elements at the bottom of the table being very baseline things, right? It doesn't meet specifications. Is this within, the cost? That's the 15% in terms of that rational aspect. And then as we go up the ladder, we can see that there are, more functional aspects, right? Productivity, relationships, strategic. These are still kind of easy enough. Oh, sorry. Still easy enough to measure and understand. But when we start getting into some of the higher levels and really start looking at some of the top of the pyramid, these are the more inspirational elements. So these help customers understand the vision, right? The future. It taps into those elements when we look at what does a customer want, right? They want to feel good about themselves. They want to feel like they are connected. They want to feel like they are have a hope, for the future. That's where this part sits. And so when we sort of think about how an organization can think about managing the tactical and the necessary, that doesn't mean in place of the emotional side. It just means that we have to think about how we stack this together to be able to create a culture by which it's not one or the other, but rather it's all of it together. Now, again, having sat in the role, I know how hard it is to actually do this alignment and to actually bring together the leaders to understand the work and to understand how they need to come together. We know that, CEOs, CHROs, they each have their own areas of focus. And so I think we as experienced professionals, really our role is to understand and speak the language of each of these different communities and areas to make sure we're speaking their language, making sure that we are able to create measurements and connections back to their spaces to help them understand that these are revenue drivers. These are attrition measures, right? We will have less turnover. We will deliver better experiences from a product and a service perspective. We can actually create more innovation and agility for the CTOs. So really understanding what those leaders are thinking about and then connecting all of this back to the leaders is critical. So lastly, what we have is a framework where we sort of talk about the 3x3x3. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. I'll leave out my contact information and I'd be happy to talk through this with anyone. But really, it starts with understanding that organizational buy-in, like we just talked about, getting very clear on the culture and the brand, understanding what you stand for, and then making sure that's consistent throughout, understanding your customer journeys as well as your employee journeys and connecting them so you can understand where those breaks are, and then establishing common metrics so that you can have those conversations with your leaders across the organization. So very quickly, at a very high level, when we talk about organizational buy-in, really building that communication and that storytelling, identifying those measurements that matter to the different leaders so that you can create those dashboards and structures for leaders, getting very clear as to not only who we are, what we stand for, but are people buying it? What are we hearing? What are we seeing from across the organization? Are they actually bought in? And if not, why not? So building out, again, just measures that help us understand from a qual and quant perspective, but then also leaning into your recognition programs. Are people actually highlighting the behaviors appropriately? And is that actually driving the connections that we want them to? As I said before, creating the employee journey, the customer journey, and then finding those overlaps to find where those breaks are and whether there's maybe a challenge internally that's creating an experience break externally. And a lot of times that really is looking at what we call a DVF prioritization, which is desirability, feasibility, and viability. Do we have that right internally and externally? And then building out the metrics along side each of those journeys. And then finally, getting those common metrics, getting those scorecards, partnering with the business leaders to understand what matters to them, and then creating the OKRs, connecting the OKRs internally from the experience design perspective, and connecting that back to what matters on the scorecard for leaders. And then finally, just to sum up, really just the summary slide. Whoops, don't know why that came out wonky. This is really about going back and remembering that experiences are deeply interconnected. The emotions matter, and they will actually drive business impact. And so the more you can think about how those connections exist, where they exist, bring HR and other business leaders to the table to really understand how we can reflect behaviors internally to then manifest externally. And more than anything, just highlight those stories, show those connection points. And just to, would love to stay in touch, would love to hear from you guys a little bit as to, work that you're leading, successes that you've seen, and, just to hear your success stories. So I look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I will stop the share and we can go to any questions.
Firstly, thank you. That was such a great session and just completely aligned to our thinking and what we believe in. And what's really interesting actually when we go through it was not just the fact that we know that a great experience can impact customer experience and that link is clear, but also how similar your experience is as an employee as it is as a customer. And I saw that Lee put in the chat that brilliant quote, which I think was from Gallup, which is, employees have become the consumers of the workplace. And it's so true.
Yeah.
How we decide where we want to work. And yeah, so I thought it was a fantastic session. So thank you so much. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. So if anyone's got any burning questions that they would like to ask, do feel free to pop them into the chat. Lee, just any kind of final thoughts from you? I saw you joined right at the beginning of the session, so you
I
didn't
did. I
say hello
missed
at the beginning.
I'm sorry. Tamar, lovely to meet you. Great session. Yeah, Katie, agreeing completely with what you said there. Great reminder that us human beings are messy, irrational, emotional creatures first and foremost. And whilst we obsess about the rational, the mind's side of work, actually so much as that iceberg captures beautifully goes on below the surface, and that's where the magic really happens. I loved the point early on about judges and sentencing. As someone who gets very grumpy as they get hungrier, that really resonated with me. So it's the physiological as well as the emotional. And a quick question, Tamar, it's easy. So from a customer experience perspective, it's relatively easy to kind of identify the brands that get that right. I guess the kind of Apples, the Coca-Colas, the Barbies, the Doves of this world. But on the on the employee side, on the internal side, it's much harder. I hadn't come across Wegmans, but have you come across any organisations that have really nailed this, that have got both sides of that coin right, that do the customer experience really well, but also live and breathe that brand internally with their people? Love your insights there.
Yeah, I think with customer, something on customer experience, it's very easy to find net promoter scores. They tend to be more public and distributed. You're not going to see employee net promoter scores. You're not going to see kind of internal scores anywhere. It's private, it's proprietary, and very often it's embarrassing, right? But I think the way that you can really get a sense of companies that do this really, really well is through the best companies to work for lists, right? The Forbes lists, things like that. Glassdoor is also just a phenomenal place to really get a sense of on the ground. They, I think, have acquired something called Fishbowl, and there's a lot of raw information there as well, where you can really get a sense of how employees are being treated throughout. So there's a number of sources that really get you to understand, what the kind of life on the ground is like. But, if you're looking for who blends it best, generally you'll see that in the best companies to work for.
Yeah, that's great. And I like real and raw evidence. I think sometimes, there's a little bit of spin with organizations, and when you dig below the surface, you often find that the reality isn't quite as rosy as it maybe seems from the outside. So things like Glassdoor, I think, are brilliant because they, as you say, they shine a real bright light on the reality. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. But thank you. Really appreciated your time and energy
pleasure.
today.
Thank you. We are now sort of up to time. I did notice there was one quick question in the chat, so if people do have to dial out, feel free to do so. Tamar, if I can just steal you for one more moment to ask this question, and that way anyone that does have to leave can watch it back when we share the recording. So the one question in the chat was that you spoke about the importance of social connection, collaboration, etc. for EX. But what are your thoughts about how AI in the workplace might impact this, both positively and negatively?
Yeah, I've actually I wrote an article recently about the role of EX on AI. One of the key areas I think of impact is we have never done a good job at understanding if the work we do is the right work. And, we tend to have a lot of busy work in organizations and people just kind of getting things done to fill time very often. I think AI is, seeking to replace work kind of as is without really doing like a deep understanding of what is the actual job to be done and are we actually then doing it most effectively. But if AI can take a lot of that nonsense work off the table, a lot of the reskilling and upskilling that's happening in organizations is to help employees, not necessarily to replace them, but to help employees kind of get some of that nonsense work out of the way so that they can elevate and escalate what they do and how they do it. Now, I think there is a risk to jobs. There is a risk to how we work. But I think for the next at least bit, while many companies are still figuring out what role AI is going to play, I think we're okay. I think there's a lot that's still TBD, but those are just my high level thoughts.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I actually think it's quite exciting, the opportunity, because all of, like you say, the busy work, it's all the stuff that gets in the way, isn't it? So it's nice to think we might actually finally get to do some of those things that we've wanted to do and explore for ages. So yeah, I think there's a real opportunity, and it's definitely something we're going to be talking about a lot more in coming webinars as well. So that was a beautiful segue. So thank you again, and thank you to everybody that did join us live. Those of you that are watching back, we will also include the slides. So yes, a huge thank you. It's been lovely to have you on, and we will see you again shortly. Our next webinar is actually next week. I believe it's on Thursday off the top of my head. Yes, that will be our benchmarking webinar. So we've got the latest benchmarking report from our sister company People Lab. So you'll be able to hear all about sort of the rights and the wrongs, what's changed, what's moved on, and what the numbers really mean, and to make sure that we use them in the right way. So yes, if you're able to join us, I will pop the link into the chat for anybody that would like to join that webinar as well. So great to see you all. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you on the next one. Thank you.